Hi, welcome everyone to another episode of Let's Talk Special Economic Zones. I'm your host, Ainsley Brown. In today's episode, we're going to discuss SDGs, that is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and Special Economic Zones. Basically, SDG zones. Is there such a thing? Now, before we go any further, let me just confess something. I am SDG obsessed. From the very first time I've heard about the SDGs, read about them, did my research and everything, I've just been obsessed with these goals. They're laudable, they're achievable, and definitely provide a roadmap in which we can create shared prosperity across the globe. I firmly believe in that. You know, COVID-19 unfortunately has put a little dent in the SDGs, or slowed the progress, or in some ways reversed progress that was made. So we really need to get back on top of that. And the for those that don't know this, the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, are an initiative from the United Nations, that there are 17 of them, ranging from, ending hunger and poverty, and, having quality education, peace and justice, life above water, below water, life on land, basically environmental protections. But it also speaks about responsible consumption, and, clean energy, and things like this. So they're very, very important. And as I said, they set a roadmap. Now, zones. How do these zones, whatever you want to call zones, and I always like to say this, like, if you want to call them um, free zones, or you want to call them special economic zones, or enterprise zones, or foreign trade zones, it's whatever you want to call it, it's all the same thing. There's little nuances here and there depending on which jurisdiction you're in around the world, but they're the same thing. A geographic area where, trade rules, slightly differ, and there may be some other fiscal and non-fiscal, maybe even financial incentives being offered for people to go there and invest. But the discussion we're having today is about the SDGs and zones. SDG zones. I know in 2019, the UNCTAD, the UN body, had put out a report, its investment report, its annual investment report, and it actually focused on special economic zones. And it had a section in there about SDGs. At the time, I thought, and I guess rightfully so, it was a bit light. I was expecting a lot more, again, being SDG obsessed. Um, but you know, a SDG zone. Um, can there be such a thing? Should there be such a thing? And I believe the answer is yes, there should be. In fact, all zones should be that way. It definitely can help as a guide for example, ESG, environment, social, and governance, has become a major issue around the world, or a major challenge, or a movement that's caught on. And, a lot of institutions, whether financial and otherwise, are looking or asking for or conducting audits that are ESG focused. The SDGs, if you attempt to implement the SDGs in your organization, whether it be from a business perspective, a regulatory perspective, you know, across governments, everything, whatever organization you're a part of, if you try to implement SDGs, you will be implementing ESG, right? The SDGs provide that guideline, or that roadmap. In fact, you'd be going beyond ESG. So I believe that if zones, and when I'm referring to zones, I'm referring right across the board, from the government policymakers all the way down to the developers that develop and operate the zones, right down to the occupants that occupy the zone and do carry out commercial operations. If you take the SDGs, some of which won't apply to you, not all 17 will apply, but if you try to implement, so for a good example is one of them where it speaks about, I think it's SDG 16, speaks about peace and justice. You know, you say, well, what does a company have to do with peace and justice? Well, whenever you have humans, you always have conflict. It's inevitable, right? Even within one person, there's self conflict. You know, you're self conflicted. How do you resolve this in a peaceful manner? You also can promote zones and companies that operate from zones are not in isolation from the wider community. The enclave model, while some still practice the enclave model of being completely separate from the domestic territory, is basically dead, particularly because of the WTO's agreement whereby trade and connection between the zone and the domestic territory is supposed to be allowed. Some still practice that enclave model, and even with that enclave model, you're still drawing from the community. You're still drawing from the domestic territory for workers. So you can always promote peace and justice because that will help your workers. So if you want to be for enlightened self-interest by doing that, you're in fact helping yourself. So that's just one example of that. And then of course that then can go in your ESG program under the social side of things, right? So you can see how these things are interconnected. So uh SDG zone um is a must. In fact, I believe all zones should be SDG zones. So if you like this episode, please like, share, subscribe, leave me a comment down below, and I'll get right back to you.